welcome to tonight's at-home version of Rhetorical Criticism. I have an absolutely monstrous setup as a tripod. If you're wondering how I achieved this angle, sincerely, you don't want to know. So continuing our discussion of gender and queer theory, the article I've selected for all of us to discuss today is Performing Transgender Identity in The Little Mermaid from Anderson to Disney. So essentially this article is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It argues for a transgender reading of both the original Hans Christian Andersen story of The Little Mermaid and the movie by the Disney Corporation in the 80s of the same name. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. I'll provide an overview of the themes in these stories and how they connect to transgender identity. But first, let's talk about the author. So Leland G. Spencer, and I thought this headshot, he looks so friendly. He's the professor and chair of women's and gender studies at the University of South Carolina. According to their website, his research interests include feminist rhetoric, gender, sexuality, gender identity, and religious education. So he's also received local and national recognition for his work surrounding gender and queerness. He has a rich background in gendered criticism and the feminist critical tradition that we just talked about earlier. So yeah, he's pretty qualified, I would say. First, we're going to talk about transgender criticism as an offshoot of queer criticism. Or as Spencer describes it, transgender criticism is an adaptation of queer criticism. I would consider this part of the paper the hear me out section. The style of writing, you can tell that as an author he's anticipating pushback for some of these ideas. And as he talks about in the article, transgender studies and feminist and queer scholarship have actually not always gotten along. It's been a bit of a contentious relationship. If you want a research hole to dive into, I would look up like the gender wars of surrounding feminist theory and criticism in the 90s, I would say. It's wild and messy. So him arguing for transgender criticism as an adaptation, an offshoot, an evolution of queer criticism, he is understanding of the possible criticism that could draw. But it's grounded in queer theory. It pulls from Doty's definition of queer criticism, which makes room for expansion. So in Doty's words, texts and people's responses to them are more sexually transmutable than any one category could signify. So Spencer's argument for reading these two mermaid narratives as transgender is it allows for a more precise reading if you call it transgender criticism versus just queer criticism. It's a very specific application of trans identity to these stories. And again, in a way that kind of protects him and uses gentle language to push this, he says it's about exploring the possibilities of transgender readings of texts. And he defends these ideas by drawing attention to the parallels between the mermaid story and identity development for trans people. And what's really important about this section of the paper where he talks about how transgender criticism fits into queer criticism as a whole, he draws attention to the fact that queer criticism can be viewed as a beginning point, as a starter for ideas. It's supposed and kind of meant to be, like we kind of talked about on Monday, a generative process, not so much constricted by these prescriptive methods. So, moving on, trans people's desired identity performances are often at odds with familial and social expectations. That comes from this text. And thinking about The Little Mermaid, both the movie and the Hans Christian Andersen's tale, that sounds pretty familiar. And trans studies are concerned with anything that disrupts normative links between biology, gender roles, and social expectations. We'll talk more about what's actually going on in these stories, but those themes are definitely salient to both Little Mermaid tales. Ah, pun. So Hans Christian Andersen, The Little Mermaid. As an overview, there's this mermaid. She wants to be a human so badly. She goes to a sea witch. The sea witch offers her a bargain, cuts out her tongue as a price to turn her human. And the bargain is that she will turn to sea foam as soon as the prince who she desires to marry, yeah, there's a prince, whoopsie daisy. There's a prince, she wants to marry him. If he marries another, she will be turned to sea foam. Popular readings of this talk about the mermaid's desire to move to the surface as primarily motivated by this romantic interest in the prince. However, it goes a little deeper than that. So let's talk about the Little Mermaid's fascination with humans. And this occurs before she actually meets the prince in both the movie and the story. She has this fascination. In the Hans Christian Andersen tale, it draws differences between humans and mermaids by saying that humans have an eternal soul and mermaids do not. And the Little Mermaid, she plants flowers in her garden that are red to remind her of the sun. So she has this yearning and an interest in the human world that is separate from her romantic interest in the prince. And we can draw parallels to this and trans people being fascinated with the identity performance that feels closer to them. So the classic example is maybe young trans people trying on clothes that might not match with their assigned, prescribed gender identity. There's this fascination, this drive to know more about what performing that identity could look like for them. So modern readings also now acknowledge Andersen's own discomfort with his sexuality, which helps situate this in a queer reading. Not to say that an author has to be queer for you to apply a queer criticism or reading to it, but it certainly helps. Moving to painful bodily transformation. So the sea witch tells this Little Mermaid that the ground is going to feel like knives. It's going to feel like constant pain. And there's a deep fixation with pain in this text, which has since drawn criticism from feminist scholars who interpret this as kind of a reveling in women's pain, as it's reiterated over and over and over again. Some people could interpret this as an extension of Andersen's own struggles and strife, but there's also the pain of her tongue is cut out. But applying a transgender reading to this has a correlation to hormone treatments or the decision to possibly have surgery. That is something that is painful, inconvenient, a financial burden totally, and difficult to access depending on where you live. But it's about a choice to change the body for the identity performance that she desires. So even though it's painful, she still chooses to undergo that transformation for the sake of living as she wants to, which is something that is definitely resonated for people under the trans identity. So let's talk about sea foam. The ending of the story, spoiler, the prince marries another. We can't have nice things. And the Little Mermaid sisters, they don't want her to be turned into sea foam, so they sell their hair to the sea witch. I don't know why that was a requirement, but they sell their hair to the sea witch in exchange for a knife. These sisters, they swim to the surface, they give the Little Mermaid the knife, and they say that if she uses the knife to kill the prince, then she'll be able to rejoin them as a mermaid. And this prompts a moment of reflection for the Little Mermaid. She, instead of killing the prince, she actually decides to give up her life instead of returning to a body and identity that she feels no connection to. And the Hans Christian Andersen text talks about her looking at the stars and mourning that she never got to get an eternal soul. So in the text, that is the essay, Spencer talks about how her grief is primarily for that loss of identity performance that she has kind of failed to achieve, more so than for the prince. So yeah, the way that Spencer words it is even in death, it's a tragic ending, but it's also an affirmation of identity performance. So, moving to Disney, we have some similar themes up top with the performance as human pre-Prince, as I've discussed already. But in the movie, this becomes a little more explicit, or at least more time is spent on this element. So Ariel, as a princess, this has a lot of similarities to the original tale. However, Ariel does not die in the end. The Little Mermaid, she instead is allowed to live as a human. We'll get to that. But she has her own stash of human artifacts, including one of which is a fork, and she tries to seek out more information about this fork. She's like, what do you use this for? She has a deep curiosity and fascination for the human world, and she expresses that through the song Part of Your World. You might be familiar with it. So again, this parallels to trans individuals seeking information about their desired identity performance, the sense of discovery, and also the sense that it should be forbidden, and kind of hidden from other people. This stash of human artifacts that the Little Mermaid keeps in the movie, she hides it from her father, and it becomes a real point of tension. So, moving to Sebastian and Triton, we get some points of interpersonal conflict. So Sebastian sings a song called Under the Sea, which is focused on performing identity. He tells Ariel, you belong in the sea, which has concerns about Siren, which has concerns about what is natural or what is right. He understands eventually that Ariel could never be happy as a mermaid, but that only comes when he sees her sadness. He tells her at a certain point to just be normal, just come back to the ocean when it seems like all hope is lost and she'll never get to marry the prince. Just come back. And then he says, or just be miserable for the rest of your life. And that's the moment where he realizes, as her friend, that she could never really be happy as a mermaid. And this mirrors trans experiences, because often family members or friends may start as unsupportive. They don't understand, again, it's this perceived violation of what is natural, or a body that they can't imagine this person that they've known for so long inhabiting, until they see kind of the strife that it takes to perform an identity that doesn't match, and that can motivate some understanding. And we definitely see that with Sebastian, who, for those of you who may not have seen the movie, Sebastian is a crab. It's a really fun time. But yeah, trans experiences is a lot of this what is normal, and I really liked Spencer draws attention to, he says, being normal is not of importance if it also means being miserable. And that's the realization that Sebastian has to come to in order to support the Little Mermaid. And then moving to Triton, who is the king of the sea and Ariel, the Little Mermaid's father. He experiences anger and confusion and frustration at her choices, both at her fascination with the human world, and then horror when she actually kind of identifies as human and embodies this human identity, which mirrors the experiences of parents of trans children. Again, this sense of confusion. When you have raised someone and you've only known them or looked at them a certain way, it can be very jarring when they decide to choose a different mode of expression, or rather not decide, but when they start inhabiting an identity that feels more authentic to them. And the essay draws attention to the fact that coming out as gay doesn't challenge notions of human nature and what is right in the same way that coming out as trans does. It confronts a lot of these notions, like especially if we bring religion into it, there's a large component of the body that God gave you. So there's, again, it's this idea of violation. And the religious element isn't present here, but I thought I would bring it up as just a kind of a corollary so you can see how this is mirrored in the real life experiences of trans people, especially when coming out to parents who can really struggle with that change. And this tension culminates in Triton destroying all of Ariel's human treasures. And this is based on the idea he sees all humans, he makes the generalization that they are dangerous monsters. And this othering of an entire group, despite never interacting with them, mirrors, that's my word of the day, mirrors. It mirrors how transphobia is often rooted in ignorance. There's this fear response, and it comes from not knowing, or maybe not having many experiences with trans people outside of these broader narratives that tend to vilify us. So, moving to temporary silencing. So this is a huge point of tension when you consider a feminist reading of the text, because Ariel has to give up her voice to join the human world. That's something that's shared in the Hans Christian Andersen version, but the word here is temporary. So when we apply a transgender reading to this aspect of the narrative, it can be seen in the lives of real transgender people, where people often describe, the author Spencer cites some qualitative interviews where people shared how they would go through periods where they stopped performing or exploring transgender identity at all. So maybe they would experiment with different forms of dress, or going under a different name before stopping. And these temporary pauses that were often influenced by social pressures around them. One person, one trans woman, she shared the experience of growing up. She was having a conversation at the dinner table, and she described something as divine, and her father punished her for that. And so as a child, she realized like she had to kind of conceal those that kind of feminine language. It's such a small infraction, but it expresses the way that we often police identity into these strict lines. So Ariel being having her voice taken away for a certain point of the film before she eventually regains it, can be seen in the experiences of trans people as well. These periods where they have to repress the extent of their full identity. So, some criticisms or limitations of this text. I have one that started as a criticism, and then actually I came around because this article is really well written. But at first, I wasn't sure about segmenting transgender criticism from queer criticism. And that's partly because my view is I'm like, well, transgender, I would consider that part of the queer umbrella. And I don't see why it would have to be different from queer criticism. But later on, especially in the conclusion, Spencer elaborates on the idea of transgender criticism and really clarifies that it's not so much separate as it is interdependent. And like we talked about earlier, queer criticism as a point of, as a beginning, as being very generative. So really viewing transgender criticism as an expansion, not so much this separate thing. So it's still under the umbrella, but again, I understand now why he felt the need to designate this as transgender criticism, because it was so specific, because it drew these one-to-one commonalities with trans experiences. And the author also talks about the possibilities for how could we expand criticism into other facets of identity. He posits maybe there's an intersex reading of The Little Mermaid, which I would love to read, but that what began as a criticism, and then I actually came around and I was like, oh, I see what the author was trying to do here. One of my criticisms or limitations is that some of these citations that the author uses are kind of outdated, or they use outdated language. So, for example, one of the citations is somewhere from the 90s, and it talks about, it was in the section on silencing. It says they would stop engaging in transgendered behavior, and that is not really language that we would use around trans identity now. That comes from an idea of transgender being something that was kind of like, we used to think of it as being kind of pathological, so transgendered behavior, like this physical expression of deviancy, that's kind of what that harkens back to. So now we might say something like, again, this article uses a lot of language like identity performance, and that is a little closer to that, instead of, like, in general, we don't really say transgendered anymore for good reason, but I will say the fact that those citations were outdated, and this was published in 2014, really hits home that we need more transgender scholarship. There are very few transgender journals that I can think of, and many of them are locked behind, say it with me, paywalls. In my own research, I have really struggled sometimes to find literature surrounding transgender criticism or theory, just kind of in general. So this points to a disciplinary need for more of this kind of work. Anyway, these are my reference, just one. I really recommend reading this article. It provides, honestly, a very strong primer on queer criticism as a whole, and acknowledges those strong disciplinary roots with feminist theory. So I couldn't recommend it more. It's an engaging read. It made me think. I had not considered The Little Mermaid as a transgender narrative, or applying a transgender reading to it. But then after I read the article, I was like, I don't know how I would see it any other way now. But not to limit anything, because queer criticism, it opens the door for one way to read a text, and we could really explore any number of ways. So thank you for listening. Essentially, The Little Mermaid, it's a trans narrative now. I don't know, it's beautiful.